2001, Southeast Iran. The Halil River floods. Not a catastrophic event, a seasonal surge, the kind that happens every few decades. The water rises, cuts into the banks, strips the topsoil, and underneath, stone walls, foundations, the remains of ziggurats older than anything in Mesopotamia, older than older than Eridu, older than the approved timeline permits. A research team at the University of Tehran would spend the next decade documenting what the river exposed, and the more they dug, the worse it got for the official narrative. Where did civilization begin? The standard answer is Mesopotamia, southern Iraq, Sumer, the land between two rivers. Every documentary repeats it, every classroom teaches it. And now, a third river, the Halil, in Iran, has a different answer, one that's been sitting under the sand for 5,000 years. And what if the real answer isn't under the sand at all, but underwater? The site is called Jiroft, Kerman Province, southeastern Iran. Archaeologist Youssef Majidzada led the first systematic excavation beginning in 2001 under the authority of Iran's Cultural Heritage and Tourism Organization. What he found was not a village, not a remote outpost, a city. Multiple ziggurats, stepped platforms of mud brick and stone, covering an area that dwarfs early Sumerian sites. A network of buildings, workshops, streets, and water channels stretching across more than 100 hectares. This wasn't a farming hamlet that got lucky. This was urban planning. Let's look at the numbers. The main ziggurat at Jiroft measures over 300 meters on its longest side. For context, the Great Ziggurat of Ur, the one in every textbook, the symbol of Sumerian civilization, is 64 by 46 meters. Jiroft's footprint is roughly 13 times larger. The mud brick walls are 4 meters thick in places. The foundations go deeper than the excavation team could reach without risking structural collapse of the surrounding sections. The dating is where the approved timeline starts to crack. Radiocarbon analysis of organic material from the lower strata places the earliest occupation layers at approximately 4,500 BC, and possibly earlier. Proto-Elamite script fragments found at the site are candidates for the oldest known writing system, not Sumerian cuneiform, not Egyptian hieroglyphs, a script that may predate both. And the inscriptions aren't isolated marks. They appear on administrative seals. Seals imply record-keeping. Record-keeping implies trade. Trade implies a network. Of course it does. The fact that Jiroft sits on a trade route connecting Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley was labeled coincidence. Not a peripheral outpost, a hub. Archaeological documentation shows that Jiroft was producing objects at an industrial scale, not crude pottery. Precision-carved chlorite vessels, hundreds of them, decorated with mythological scenes of extraordinary complexity. Animals, humans, divine figures intertwined in narrative compositions, carved from a stone so soft it crumbles if you grip it wrong, yet finished with walls barely 2 millimeters thick. The tooling question alone should keep a materials engineer awake for a week. How do you achieve sub-millimeter consistency in a material that fractures under uneven pressure, using tools that officially didn't exist in this era? But it's one particular shape among those chlorite objects that turns a regional archaeological puzzle into a global one. The shape of a handbag. Rectangular, slightly rounded at the top with a handle. Carved into chlorite at Jiroft, dozens of examples, standardized proportions. The same shape, the same proportions, appears on the T-pillars of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, carved 12,000 years ago by people who hadn't invented pottery, hadn't domesticated grain, hadn't built cities. The same shape appears on Olmec and Aztec relief carvings in Mesoamerica, La Venta, Mexico, where colossal basalt heads stare from the jungle floor. 3 continents, millennia apart, thousands of miles of ocean and desert between them. One object, one coincidence. The same object on 3 continents. That's a different conversation entirely. According to Massimo Vidali at the University of Padova, the chlorite workshops at Jiroft were not producing occasional ritual objects. This was mass production. Hundreds of vessels, standardized forms, specialized tools, even evidence of workshop debris consistent with division of labor. An export industry 4,000 years before the concept was supposed to exist. And among those exports, the handbag appears with a frequency that rules out decoration. It had a function. What function? Nobody agrees. Vidali documented the production chain. What he couldn't document was the meaning. But its presence on Göbekli Tepe's pillars, carved in stone by people who hadn't invented pottery, and its presence on Mesoamerican monuments built by people who never had contact with Iran, that's not a supply chain. That's a question nobody in mainstream archaeology wants to sit with for long. Like handing 3 unconnected people the same blueprint, and none of them can explain where they got it. Here's what makes the handbag problem worse. At Göbekli Tepe, the handbag shape is carved into Pillar 43, the so-called vulture stone, alongside a scorpion, a vulture, and other animal forms. The German Archaeological Institute, under Klaus Schmidt, dated the pillar to approximately 9,600 BC. That's 6,000 years before Jiroft. At La Venta in Mexico, the same shape appears in the hands of colossal Olmec figures dating to roughly 900 BC. That's 3,000 years after Jiroft. The chronological spread alone, from 9,600 BC to 900 BC, nearly 9 millennia, rules out any single transmission event. Whatever this object represents, it persisted across a time frame longer than all of recorded history. The facts point to something uncomfortable. Either 3 unconnected civilizations independently invented the same symbolic object with the same proportions, or the object predates all 3, and predates them by enough time for it to travel. Through what network? Through whom? The investigation leads nowhere comfortable. But it leads somewhere specific, because Jiroft has another anomaly, one that doesn't involve symbolism at all. It involves chemistry, and chemistry doesn't care about symbols. Standard Bronze Age metallurgy follows a recipe. Copper plus tin equals bronze. The Sumerians used it, the Egyptians used it. The recipe spread along trade routes, documented, replicated, improved over centuries. Jiroft's metallurgists used a different recipe: copper plus arsenic. Arsenic bronze is not a primitive substitute. It's a parallel technology. The melting points are different. The alloy behavior is different. The process is different and spectacularly dangerous. Arsenic fumes are lethal at concentrations measured in parts per million. One miscalculation in the smelting temperature, and the arsenic vaporizes, the metallurgist dies. The margin between a usable alloy and a toxic disaster is measured in fractions of a percent. Here's what the numbers show. Jiroft's arsenic bronze artifacts show consistent arsenic content, between 2 and 6%, across multiple objects and multiple sites within the Jiroft cultural sphere. That's not trial and error. That's quality control. Someone had mastered dosing a lethal element with the precision of a pharmacist, and had been doing it long enough to standardize the process across workshops spread over hundreds of kilometers. Amazing how many coincidences it takes to avoid a pattern. The alloy itself tells you everything. It shows hardness values comparable to tin bronze, with superior casting properties at lower temperatures. This wasn't a worse version of the standard recipe. It was a different school, an independent metallurgical tradition running in parallel to the entire known Bronze Age, producing results that required chemical knowledge the approved timeline doesn't account for. No instruction manual, no trade contact with Mesopotamian copper-tin foundries. A tradition that answered to no one. And here's the detail that changes the trajectory of this investigation entirely. If Jiroft was this advanced, this old, this connected, this technically capable, then where did it come from? Cities don't appear fully formed. Writing systems don't emerge without predecessors. Metallurgical traditions don't spring from nothing. Jiroft had to have a source, a predecessor, something older. And that's where the story goes underwater. During the last ice age, sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than today. The entire Persian Gulf was dry land. Not a shallow sea, dry land. A vast lowland stretching from modern Kuwait to the Strait of Hormuz, fed by 4 rivers: the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Karun, and the Wadi Batin. 4 rivers flowing through a garden, fresh water, lush vegetation, a climate capable of sustaining large populations for millennia. Not a bad place to start a civilization. The oldest texts in the Judeo-Christian tradition describe exactly this: a garden, 4 rivers, a world before the flood. Whether that's memory or coincidence is a question for another investigation. Jeffrey Rose, in a landmark paper published in Current Anthropology in 2010, proposed what he called the Gulf Oasis hypothesis. Based on geological surveys, seabed mapping, and paleoclimate data, Rose argued that the exposed Persian Gulf floor was not empty wasteland. It was prime real estate. Freshwater springs fed by underground aquifers, river deltas thick with sediment, natural harbors along coastlines that no longer exist. The kind of environment that doesn't just attract settlement, it demands it. Just so you understand the scale, the area of the exposed Gulf floor during the glacial maximum was larger than Great Britain, an entire country-sized lowland, habitable, fertile, connected to the river systems of Mesopotamia, and completely invisible today under 60 meters of seawater. Every bathymetric survey of the Gulf shows the river channels on the seabed. The Tigris and Euphrates carved valleys across that floor when it was dry, and those valleys are still traceable with sonar. The rivers were there. The land was there. The only question is whether anyone was living on it. Around 8000 BC, the Indian Ocean broke through the Strait of Hormuz. The water didn't arrive overnight, but it arrived fast, over centuries, not millennia. Modern dating methods indicate the transgression was complete by roughly 6000 BC. The entire lowland flooded. Every settlement, every structure, every trace of habitation buried under the Gulf. That's not speculation, that's geology. The transgression is documented in sediment cores from the seabed, in the sudden appearance of marine fauna where freshwater fauna had been, in the shift from terrestrial to marine pollen in core samples. The flood is a measurable event. The only thing unmeasured is what it swallowed. And then, in the historical record, something peculiar happens. Sumer appears, seemingly from nowhere, with writing, with agriculture, with astronomy, with law codes, with irrigation systems of extraordinary sophistication, canals, sluice gates, distribution networks for water management across hundreds of square kilometers. The Sumerian miracle, a civilization that arrives fully formed, with institutions that should have taken centuries to develop appearing in the archaeological record as if someone had flipped a switch. That's like finding a finished novel on a desk, with no drafts, no notes, and no author in the room. Mainstream scholarship calls this rapid cultural development. That was the first layer. There's another one beneath it. The Sumerians themselves told a different story. In their own texts, the Eridu Genesis, the king lists, the mythological corpus, they described beings called Apkallu, semi-divine sages, bringers of knowledge. 7 of them, each associated with a specific field of expertise: agriculture, medicine, architecture, astronomy, writing, law, metalworking. And here's the part that makes it impossible to ignore. The Apkallu emerged from the waters of the Persian Gulf. Not from the mountains, not from the sky, from the sea. Berosus, a Babylonian priest writing in the 3rd century BC, recorded the tradition in Greek for a Hellenistic audience. The first Apkallu, Adapa, also called Oannes, rose from the Persian Gulf and taught humanity writing, agriculture, mathematics, and city building. Every institution Sumer claimed as its own, attributed, in Sumer's own records, to beings who came from the water. This detail rarely makes it into the mainstream version. The Sumerians are quoted when their records support the conventional narrative. When their records contradict it, the records become mythology. If a civilization had existed on the now flooded Gulf floor, a civilization older than Sumer, more advanced than the approved timeline allows, then the Apkallu tradition isn't mythology. It's a memory, a cultural record of refugees from a drowned world arriving on Sumer's shores with knowledge that took generations to develop and being remembered as something more than human. Because when someone arrives with technology you can't explain, you don't call them a neighbor, you call them a god. What do you call a refugee with a blueprint? Apparently, a god. Follow the trail into Sumerian records. The Apkallu tradition wasn't peripheral to Sumerian identity, it was foundational. The 7 sages appear on cylinder seals, on temple reliefs, in incantation texts, in royal correspondence. Mesopotamian kings traced their legitimacy through the Apkallu lineage. This wasn't folk legend told around a fire. It was state doctrine, the official origin story of the most documented civilization of the ancient world. And the origin story says, "We came from the water." Not everyone in academia buys this. Rose's hypothesis is not universally accepted. But the geology is not in dispute. The Gulf was dry, it flooded, and Sumer appeared immediately afterward, fully equipped with knowledge it shouldn't have had. That's not opinion, that's a sequence of events. Sound familiar? A garden, 4 rivers, a catastrophic flood, and a civilization that remembers the disaster but not the world that came before. The pattern repeats across cultures. Whether the pattern is evidence or echo, that's the investigation. Naturally, the standard accounts filed it under coincidence. The Indian Ocean broke through the Strait of Hormuz and drowned a world. But what's sitting on top of that strait right now, on the surface, in plain sight? Qeshm Island, the largest island in the Persian Gulf. Sitting dead center in the Strait of Hormuz, the most strategically critical choke point on Earth, through which roughly 40% of the world's seaborne oil passes daily. 60 kilometers of limestone and sandstone, contested by every empire that ever controlled the Gulf. The island has a place the locals call the Valley of Stars. Rock formations unlike anything else in the region. Columns, arches, symmetrical grottos carved into coastal limestone and sandstone. Shapes that look engineered. Smooth curves, repeating geometries. Chambers with acoustic properties that amplify the slightest whisper. Local legends say a star fell and melted the earth. Iranian geological surveys classify the formations as natural erosion, wind and salt weathering over millions of years. Let's do the math on that explanation. Salt weathering produces rough, pitted surfaces, irregular cavities, honeycomb patterns, random dissolution features. What the Valley of Stars shows is different. Smooth-walled chambers, symmetrical arches, columns with consistent diameters. The shapes are too regular for salt weathering, too symmetrical for wind erosion, too architectural for coincidence. Close enough to design that nature gets the blame, and far enough from it that the explanation never lands. The forms fit no known erosion model with this degree of regularity. They don't fit construction either. There are no tool marks, no quarry waste, no evidence of human hands. They sit in a category that geology doesn't have a name for. Too regular for nature, too ancient for technology. The official explanation doesn't survive scrutiny, but neither does any alternative. The Valley of Stars exists, and nobody can tell you what made it. A star fell and melted the earth. The legend is probably wrong, but the geology that's supposed to replace it hasn't provided an answer either. And the Valley of Stars is just the surface. What's underneath is stranger. Directly beneath Qeshm, beneath the island, beneath the Strait of Hormuz, lies Namakdan, the longest salt cave in the world, 17 kilometers of tunnels carved through a salt diapir, a massive underground dome of crystallized salt pushed upward by tectonic pressure over millions of years. The salt is ancient. The cave system is younger, formed as groundwater dissolved channels through the dome. Or so the standard model says. Geophysical surveys found that the cave system extends in multiple directions, with galleries reaching depths of over 100 meters below the island's surface. Some passages are wide enough to drive through. Some are barely shoulder width. Stalactites of salt, white, translucent, glowing under lamplight, hang from ceilings in chambers large enough to hold a cathedral. The cave breathes. Air pressure shifts with the tides because the salt dome is partially below sea level. Warm air pushes in when the tide drops. Cool air pulls back when it rises. Stand at the entrance long enough and you feel it. The cave has a pulse, slow and tidal. The official classification is entirely natural. Salt dissolution by groundwater over geological time. And for most of the system, that explanation works. Salt dissolves, water carves, caves form. But there are sections, documented by the Czech Speleological Society during their 2006 survey, where the galleries are suspiciously straight, where side passages branch at consistent angles, where the floor is level for hundreds of meters in a formation that should be chaotic. One straight gallery is dissolution. 3 parallel straight galleries at the same depth with perpendicular branching, that's worth a question. Natural? Probably. Modified? The data doesn't say no. The cave system has never been fully mapped. 17 kilometers is the surveyed length. The actual extent is unknown. Some passages are blocked by salt collapses. Others narrow to dimensions no human can pass through, but continue beyond, confirmed by airflow measurements showing draft from unmapped chambers. And the location, directly beneath the most strategic waterway on the planet, on an island with surface formations that defy standard erosion models, in a gulf that was dry land 8,000 years ago, is either the most remarkable geological coincidence in the region, or it's something the conventional narrative has no framework to address. When you compare these side by side, the city under the sand, the world under the water, the anomalies on the island, a picture forms. Not a conclusion, a picture. Under the sand of Iran, a city. Ziggurats older than Sumer, writing older than cuneiform, a metallurgical tradition that ran parallel to the entire Bronze Age world and answered to no one. Industrial-scale production of objects found on 3 continents millennia apart, with no documented contact between the cultures. Under the water of the Persian Gulf, a drowned world. An entire lowland, larger than Great Britain, fed by 4 rivers, flooded in centuries. And immediately after the flood, Sumer appears, fully formed, crediting its knowledge to beings who rose from the sea. On the island, melted rocks that fit no erosion model, and 17 kilometers of salt tunnels beneath the strait. Iran is not the periphery of civilization. The body of evidence includes sites, artifacts, chemistry, geology, and the Sumerians' own testimony. The approved timeline places the cradle of civilization in Mesopotamia. The data places it earlier, further east, and 60 meters underwater. Every civilization leaves a footprint. Jiroft left ziggurats, chlorite workshops, and a writing system that predates the ones we teach in school. The Gulf Oasis left river channels still carved into the seabed, visible on sonar, mapped by oceanographic surveys, untouched by any archaeological expedition. The Apkallu left their own record, in the words of the civilization they supposedly created. We may be the first generation with the tools to test this. Sonar that can map the Gulf floor at centimeter resolution. Submersibles that can reach the river channels still carved into the seabed. Drilling rigs that can pull core samples from beneath the marine sediment. The technology exists. It has existed for decades. The question is whether anyone will point it at the Gulf floor and accept whatever it finds. Under the sand, a city. Under the water, a world. On the island, melted rocks. But buried knowledge is one thing. What about objects too heavy to hide? 6 blocks, 6 impossible weights. No crane on Earth can lift them, and they've been standing for thousands of years.